shortly after midnight, barring a last-minute stay, a prisoner in Utah will be executed for a murder he committed nearly a quarter century ago. And at his own request, it will be death by firing squad.
In 1985, a man is being escorted through a basement underneath a courthouse. He's a convicted killer, but waiting for him is a woman with a pistol hidden under her clothes. And she would manage to get that pistol to this man. And with that, he would end up killing someone, wounding others, and actually escaping as well. And this wasn't the first time that he had escaped prison. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. I upload on Mondays a video version and on Thursdays a podcast exclusive. So make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. So our case today it centres around a man called Ronnie Lee Gardner. He's 23 years old, and by this point, he's already got an incredibly long and complex criminal record. He dropped out of school in the 4th grade, and from that point on, things were pretty challenging, shall we say. He started using drugs really, really early on. He would fund that drug habit by stealing from anyone, family, friends. He even started stealing and robbing from establishments like shops and companies and anywhere he could break into, really. And the drugs that he was using were cocaine and heroin mainly. Now, when he got caught, which he did a number of times, he was taken to prison, but prison really wasn't much of a deterrent. In fact, he used those prison stays as a kind of training ground. He would watch the guards' shift patterns. He would also have a look at how high the walls were, trying to plot and plan as to how he might escape, especially if he was ever in there for a longer period of time. He'd already made one failed prison escape attempt a little while earlier. He'd actually scaled up to the top of the walls in this Utah prison, and he'd gotten pretty far actually, but then a couple of guards had spotted him, and then just moments later he was brought back and he was punished for that. But that wasn't going to be the end of his escape attempts, and in fact, he was just waiting for the opportune moment, and that came in August of 1984. Ronnie hatched this plan that on paper it almost seems like it's fiction, like no one would ever actually be able to do this and get away with it. But in Ronnie's case, he did. So he got this drug that he took that was known to induce vomiting. And his plan was just to keep vomiting and vomiting so that the people at the prison, in the prison infirmary, they wouldn't know what to do, and they would send him to a hospital and he'd make his escape there. And so he was taken to the nurse inside the prison, and the nurse was trying to figure out what was wrong. Obviously, Ronnie's not saying, he's not going to give up what's happening. And so he's saying, I don't know where this has come from. It just came on all of a sudden, but I feel really, really bad. I feel really, really sick, and I think I need to see someone else. And the nurse had no choice at this point. He just kept vomiting and vomiting and vomiting. She couldn't stop it. And so she decided to send him to a local hospital about 40 minutes away. And so he was escorted by, and actually shackled to, a man called Don Leavitt. And he was a transportation officer. So this is his job. This is what he does. He gets prisoners from A to B. And so he takes Ronnie to the hospital. They get there in one piece, safe and sound. And he takes him up to where he's going to be treated and examined. Now, as they get there, Ronnie's obviously being sick. He's vomiting this entire time. And as they get inside, they kind of settle down. Ronnie's still ill. But of course, we know that this is self-induced. He knows what's happening to him. He's not necessarily worried. He knows it's gonna subside at some point. And as soon as it started to get a little less, as soon as he realised that he didn't feel as weak anymore or as helpless, he decided to make his move. So what he did was he waited for a slight lapse in concentration from Don, and as soon as he saw that, he took it as his opportunity. He ended up pummeling into Don's face with his fists, punching him over and over and over again. And I really can't stress how violent and brutal this attack was. Ronnie ends up punching Don so hard that he ends up fracturing 14 of the bones in his face, in his jaw, his chin, in his cheeks and his eye sockets, as well as his nose. Now, as this is happening, Don's obviously trying to cover his face. He's trying to protect himself, and he's kind of cowered over like in a lump in the corner. And so he's not thinking about anything other than protecting himself, keeping himself alive. And so Ronnie sees that as yet again another opportunity, and he takes the .38 caliber pistol from Don, his weapon that he uses for his job. He takes it from him and he manages to escape out of the hospital. Now, as he gets out of the hospital, he gets into the car park and he sees a man getting off of his motorbike. The man's name is Michael Lynch, and he's a pre-med student. He's in his early 20s, and he's just there to attend a study session. What he doesn't realise is that there is this escaped convict who's just come out of the hospital. And so Ronnie sees him and immediately puts his gun to his head, to Michael's head, and says, "You are going to do exactly what I say. I don't want to hurt you, but I've got nothing to lose." And it's at this point that Michael realises this man is serious and his life really is in danger. And so he just does whatever Ronnie says. And at this point, Ronnie says, "Right, get back on your bike. I'm going to get behind you and you are going to take me across town. I'll direct you." So he directs him across town. They arrive not long later at an apartment complex. They go inside, and that is where Ronnie decides he strips off Michael, takes his clothes, he dresses himself in them, so now he's in a disguise, so anyone looking for him, they're not going to know what he looks like. He's not in a prison-issued jumpsuit. He is in just normal, everyday civilian clothes. And so he gets dressed in these. He then ties Michael up with his own shoelaces and escapes. And this is something, I don't really understand this, especially where we get to later with Ronnie's lack of remorse, his kind of lack of conscience, it seems. But at this point, Ronnie seems to have some kind of weird moment of remorse. And so he writes a note, and that note says basically that he's really sorry about what he's done, and he wants to make sure that this gun that he's stolen, as well as the wallet he stole from Don, he wants to make sure they both get back to him. And so he wraps it in a sock and then gives it to his brother Randy and says, "You need to drop this in a mailbox and make sure it gets back to Don." In that note, he also wrote, "I don't want to hurt nobody, I just want to be free." And then for the next 2 months, Ronnie lives pretty recklessly. He's just getting high, he's stealing, again, pretty much doing the life that he had lived prior to prison. And this confused me a little bit because I think now I would assume, maybe wrongly, but I would assume that anyone who breaks out of prison, there's going to be a manhunt. Like, people are going to be on the lookout for you. The police officers in charge are going to be paying your friends and your family a visit and seeing if they've seen you and if there's any evidence that you've come into contact with them recently. But in this case, Ronnie was literally bouncing from friend's house to family members to ex-girlfriends. He was living with his ex-girlfriend, Deborah, and their 2 children for a big portion of this 2.5 month time that he had escaped prison. And yet the police did not find him. Now, whilst he was living with his ex-partner, Deborah, and his kids, he also grew close to this other woman, a woman called Darcy, and she's important for later, so just ping, remember that name. And so Ronnie actually started dating this woman, Darcy, and things kind of went from bad to worse. Both of them were addicted to drugs, and so their main focus was on getting their next fix, and to do that, they obviously needed money, and they both didn't have jobs. Obviously, Ronnie couldn't have a job. He's literally escaped from prison. And so they decide that they're just going to rob wherever they can. And they set their sights on this little pub, this little tavern not far out of town. It was October 24th, 1984 that they set their sights on this little tavern, Cheers Tavern in Salt Lake City. The plan was pretty simple. Darcy would drive them both there. She would stay outside, keep the engine running. Ronnie would run inside, threaten the person behind the bar, steal the money, and then leave. Now, that night behind the bar was 37-year-old Melvyn Otterstrom. And Melvyn wasn't actually a bartender full-time. That wasn't his real job. His day-to-day kind of Monday to Friday 9 to 5 was working at Utah Paper Box Company, and he works there. That's how he provided for his wife and their 3-year-old son, Jason. But quite recently, one of Melvyn's family members had gotten ill and needed help with medical bills. And so Melvyn said, that's fine. Look, I've got some spare time. I'm going to go and work at this bar just one night a week so I can still spend time with my son, with Jason, see him growing up, can still spend time with my wife. But doing one more day a week's work, it's not a big deal. And just to give you an idea of who Melvyn was, he, as a kind of physical body, he is physically very fit. He's tall. He's kind of like, he could be scary. But the thing is, so was Ronnie. They had both trained to a military level. And of course, in Ronnie's case, he's not just that way. He is also violent and desperate and kind of will do anything to get that money. Just before closing time, Ronnie walked into the tavern. Now, what happens next depends on who you ask. Ronnie's version of the events was that there was a struggle inside. Melvyn wouldn't give him the money, and so he kind of panicked and ended up having to shoot him, and then escaped through the door, went into Darcy's car, and they drove off together. But Melvyn's cousin, Craig Watson, who actually did witness the aftermath, he said that there was no struggle. Now, I'm not sure how much he saw, how much he claims to have seen, but he said there was no struggle. What happened was that Ronnie walked into the bar, put his gun in Melvyn's face, and immediately pulled the trigger. There was no discussion, there was no argument. He just did that, went behind the bar, into the till, took the money, which totaled less than $100, and then escaped. Now, Melvyn had been shot. He was killed instantly, and he lay behind the bar until what he wouldn't have realised at that time was that Kitty had just pulled in outside into the parking lot, car park. And so she gets out of her car. She has no idea that any of this has happened. She walks into the tavern, looks around, realises that Melvyn's not there, and it's very quiet. She doesn't know what's going on. But then she peeks something chilling. She sees that there is a lot of blood. And as she gets closer to the bar, she peers round and she sees the lifeless body of her husband on the floor. And if you have ever had the unfortunate opportunity to have seen someone who's been shot point blank range in the head, you will know that that is a horrific, awful, awful sight. And so Kitty is seeing this of her husband. That is her last memory of him, is his head blown off. Now, immediately, of course, the police start their investigation, and it actually doesn't take them long to find him. It is within a couple of weeks, but bearing in mind, Ronnie's been escaped from prison for over 2.5 months. This couple of weeks is actually a lot shorter than I expected it would be. So very basically put, they got a tip off from one of Ronnie's family members. It turned out he was staying at his cousin's house. And so they went there, they arrested him, they brought him back to prison. And now he is facing a possible life sentence, perhaps even the death penalty. And the woman who'd been by his side that night, the woman who said she loved him, Darcy McCoy, she cut her losses pretty much immediately. She said that she would testify. If she got immunity, she would testify against Ronnie, and that was granted. Now, by this point, doctors and prison officials have been looking at Ronnie, they've been evaluating him, and they realise that he has antisocial personality disorder. People with this disorder can show complete indifference to other people's feelings. They can have a really explosive temper and just get really frustrated with others really, really quickly. In short, what they were saying was that this disorder may have been one of the reasons or part of the reason as to why Ronnie just didn't seem to care at all about hurting other people. And for Ronnie, that really rang true. There were occasions when conscience and kind of care would flicker in and out. We saw it earlier with the fact he wrote this note and returned Don's belongings to him. But other than that, it's so fleeting and so few and far between that most of the time he shows no remorse and actually verbally says that he doesn't care about what he's done. And he says this a number of times. So who was Ronnie Lee Gardner? He was born in Salt Lake City in January of 1961, and he was the 7th child of Ruth and Dan Gardner. And it seems that both his parents were they had dependency on alcohol. Ruth drank all during her pregnancy with Ronnie, and when he was born, it's reported that she just didn't really care. She'd much rather be out at the pub. She didn't give her children a lot of time or attention. And it was similar with Dan. It's not reported that he had alcohol addiction, but it is reported that he would drink a lot and he would kind of prioritize that for whatever reason and just not care for his kids. And Dan actually wasn't there for a lot of Ronnie's childhood. He was only there until Ronnie was about 1.5 years old. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So one is that every time he drank alcohol, he would get violent, he would become aggressive, and he regularly beat the children. But also he was particularly harsh to Ronnie because he didn't even believe that Ronnie was his. He thought his wife Ruth had an affair, cheated on him, and Ronnie wasn't even his blood. And so by the time Ronnie was 1.5 years old, Dan left the family, just walked out, and Ruth is left behind. She's completely disinterested. She does not want to care for these kids. She's incredibly neglectful. And this is proven by a number of accounts we have from after the fact. So we know that there was one point when Ronnie was about 2 years old that he was found wandering the streets. He's just in a nappy, a diaper, and he is just wandering around. And these neighbours find him and realise that he looks very malnourished. He looks cold. He's out on his own, unsupervised. They realise something is very wrong. It was later testified that a failure to care petition was filed against Ruth, but somehow this didn't go any further, and she did actually end up keeping custody of the children. By the age of 4, Ronnie had contracted meningitis, and then by age 6, something had started taking over America. And I mean this in terms of a kind of new fad, a new trend that really influenced kids more than anyone else. And that was sniffing glue and huffing gas. And it's kind of absurd to think of it now, I think, but in the 1960s, 70s and beyond, it was a real popular kind of fad amongst kids. They would do this to get high, and it was a really accessible thing for them because they could just get the glue from their, toy aeroplanes that was sold in every toy store across the country, or gasoline that they found in their parents' garage. It was super accessible and terrifying for adults, parents, because they didn't need there to be a drug dealer in this kind of relationship to drugs. Instead, it was just their kids finding things that were accessible to them, meeting down little alleyways or in their bedrooms when their parents weren't in. Maybe they were at work, and they would get high together. And for Ronnie, this damage was permanent. He would experience things like blackouts, memory loss, hallucinations, and in some cases it did cause death. It was a really big issue at the time. Ronnie already struggled with his learning, but after years of inhaling gas, sniffing glue, after years of that, his learning just stagnated completely. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, and it wasn't long before he was put in special education classes. But alongside this came constant ridicule. He was humiliated, he was beat up, and he started to fight back. And his response was to get very defensive, very aggressive. And that was kind of how he learnt to protect himself. Ronnie also would later say that by the time he was 5 years old, he had actually begun being molested and sexually assaulted by an older brother and an older sister. And things at home were just getting worse because by the time he was 15 years old, his mum had started to date this guy called Bill Lucas. And Bill was a career criminal, and he would use both Ronnie and his brother Randy to help him with his criminal activities. So he would take them across Utah and across Wyoming, and he'd make them act as lookouts as he then robbed stores or burglarized houses or mugged people. Bill even cracked open these gas meters, and then he'd siphon the mercury into jars and sell it at the black market. But whilst he was doing this, he was getting Randy and Ronnie to help him, and they would just be like touching all of this really, really toxic mercury, likely adding another layer of neurological damage. By 1968, Bill had been taken back to prison, and so Randy and Ronnie really had lost the only father figure that they had. And they were eventually sent to a juvenile detention centre. And it seems more like they were arrested for stealing boots and put in this juvenile detention centre. But when it came time to pick them up and bring them home, Ruth had sort of washed her hands of the boys. She didn't want anything to do with them. And so their father, Dan, came to pick them up. But here's the thing, is that we know Dan's relationship to Ronnie wasn't good. We know that he didn't believe Ronnie was his son. And so when he came to pick them up, he ended up saying, Ronnie, I'm not taking you home. I'm here for Randy, and you can stay here for all I care. I don't care about you. I don't want anything to do with you. And then he took Randy and just left. And so Ronnie was left there really not sure what was next for him. He'd been completely abandoned by his parents. And we know that Ruth didn't want anything to do with him. So from the ages of 11 to 14, for an 18-month period in that time, when he was not in a juvenile detention centre, when he was not trying to live with his mother or with one of his mother's boyfriends, he ended up being placed in Utah State Hospital in the psychiatric facility that was there. And it seems that Ronnie really didn't belong there. It seemed that he wasn't psychotic. And so he spent time around people who he just didn't understand. He wasn't looked after. He wasn't cared for, as I'm sure many of the people there weren't either. And in fact, the skills that he learnt there were to pick fights, to attack people, and learned criminal tricks. It really cemented his reputation with police. They were really aware of him at this time. Now, when he eventually left, he couldn't go to his dad. He couldn't go to his mum. And so he was placed in a foster home with a man called Jack Statt. And Jack Statt was a predator. He molested Ronnie, and then later when his brother Randy joined him in that foster home, he molested him too. And the thing was, because he hadn't been used to any kind of attention or affection, he mistook this for care. And so for those years during his abuse, he didn't realise that it was abuse, and he confused it for consistent kindness towards him. Throughout the rest of his teenage years, Ronnie's criminal record grew. He kept assaulting people, robbing places, robbing establishments, robbing people. And then a few years later, he met a woman called Deborah Bishkoff, and the two started a relationship. They very much were still teenagers at this point. But then in 1977, they had their first child together, a little girl, and they called her Brandy. And then 3 years later, they had another child, this time a boy, and they decided to call him Dan, which obviously, if you remember, his dad's name was Dan. His dad, who had abandoned him, said that he didn't want anything to do with him, said he wasn't even his son. But in this case, Ronnie wants some kind of, I don't know, connection to his dad, maybe some kind of approval, like, well done. And I don't even know if his dad ever found out that he'd called his son after him. Essentially, that means, I suppose, it's his grandson, if, of course, Ronnie is his son. There's no real reason or evidence as to why the dad would think that Ronnie wasn't his son, but I suppose because Ruth had various different boyfriends, that's what he based it off of. It might be true, but we just don't know. And the point is, Ronnie's dad didn't know that either. He had just assumed and went with that. So, back to our present day. We are in prison with Ronnie, and he realises he's got two choices. He either is going to be in prison forever, he's going to die here, or he's going to escape. Now, throughout this, there was one person who remained loyal to Ronnie, and that person was Karma Hainsworth. Karma was the sister of his old girlfriend, Darcy. So Darcy had kind of given him up and washed her hands of him, but Karma had stayed connected to him. She had written to him, she went and visited him, and eventually she agreed to help him. And his plan was pretty simple. He said to Karma, if you can sneak a gun into the courthouse, I will arrange to have a meeting with my lawyers, and once I'm in that room with the lawyers, you can slip me this gun that you've hidden, and then I will find a way to escape. And Karma agreed. Now, it's worth pausing here just for a moment to talk about the kind of structure, the physical structure of the courtroom, because this plan only worked because of how vulnerable that building was. So it's a concrete building, it's 9 stories high. And in 1985, when this was, courthouse security was very, very lax. They didn't have, certainly in this case, they didn't have X-ray machines, metal detectors, nothing like that. And usually the prisoners would be escorted by just one guard. In this case, Randy was escorted by 2 guards, but there certainly wasn't a sense of anything could happen. He could become violent, he could try and escape. And even once they were inside the courtroom, although the inmates might have restraints on them to begin with, once they were inside that courtroom, often they moved those restraints because they didn't want to bias the jury either way. Today, you would never see a defendant just walking through the courtroom hallways or the courthouse hallways completely unrestrained, just walking past reporters, judges, family members. But in the 1980s, this was pretty standard practice. So it's April 2nd, 1985, and Ronnie is led through to the basement of this courthouse building. And waiting there is Karma. She sprints up to him and presses something to him from under her clothes. He pulls away the gun. She then sprints out of the basement and away. But now we know that Ronnie's got that gun, and inside that room with him are 2 officers that have been escorting him, but they're not really sure what's just happened. They haven't been able to see it too clearly. And so as soon as it's clear to do so, Ronnie pulls out the gun and he just starts firing all over the shop. He keeps going, and eventually the 2 officers in the room with him start firing back. But by this time, he's almost out the door. They do actually hit him though. 1 bullet does strike him in the chest, but whether because it doesn't go that deep or I don't know, adrenaline or something, he is able to keep moving, and he escapes that room and continues on. He's heading for the outside door, but on the way, he has to pass through another room, and he bursts into the courthouse archives room, and inside there are a number of people. One of these people is, there's 2 lawyers. One is a man called Michael Burdell, and the other Robert Marcy. Both are volunteer lawyers. They're there to help people who can't necessarily afford representation. And that morning, they are there to do good. And so Ronnie's burst into this room. He sees what's happening around him, and he immediately points the gun at Robert. But then, almost as soon as he does that, he turns and fires the gun at Michael. He fires twice, hitting him in the eye and killing him instantly. Michael, who is this man who has dedicated his entire life to helping the vulnerable, he is just executed there on the spot. And from there, Ronnie knows that now he needs to escape. There's so much gunfire going on. There are people in this building who are armed, and he knows it's only a matter of time before he's caught. And so he manages to get out of that room and head towards the door. But on his way, he runs into a uniformed bailiff called Nick Kirk, and Nick is unarmed. He's just there to do his job, but this startles Ronnie slightly, and so he raises his gun and shoots him in the lower abdomen. And by now, the courtroom is absolute chaos, and so Ronnie continues forward, and this time he grabs whoever he can, and he sees this man who is he's a vending machine worker. He's working on a machine at that point, kind of turning around thinking, what is going on? And he grabs him and pulls him, gun to him, and says, come with me now. And obviously the man doesn't know what's going on, but there is a gun in his face, and he goes with him. Ronnie dragged the man outside, but this man has quick thinking. He realizes that he needs to get out of here as soon as possible in whatever way. And so he actually darts through a clerk's open window. And with that, Ronnie's exposed. There are dozens of police officers around him. He's obviously got this gun, and he just doesn't know what to do. He panics. He throws his gun to the side and shouts that he's surrendering, he's unarmed, and then lies down on the floor. All of that bloodshed, all of those injuries, deaths, are for nothing. And so obviously Ronnie is taken into custody, and he now faces 2 trials. He faces the first trial for the murder of Melvyn, the bar worker, and he faces the second trial for the horror that's just ensued. So in the first half of 1985, he goes on trial for Melvyn's murder, and His defense lawyers managed to get him a lesser charge for second-degree murder, and he's sentenced to just 5 years to life. But this actually wouldn't be so important in terms of the amount of time he's sentenced to compared to what he actually ends up getting because of that second trial that he faces. So for the second trial, he is accused of the murder of that lawyer, Michael Burdell. So he is taken to court, goes on trial, he's found guilty, the jury do not take long to deliberate, and they recommend that he gets the death penalty. And when asked how he wanted to die, Ronnie picks an execution style that's actually no longer available in the state of Utah, and that is death by firing squad. And so that is decided in terms of his punishment, but realistically, the violence that had ensued because of Ronnie, under Ronnie's hand, that didn't stop that day of the courthouse. Remember that guy that he had shot, Nick Kirk, the uniformed, unarmed bailiff? He had survived the shooting, but he was in a really bad way. Basically, the bullet had gone through his torso and it had torn up his bowels. It meant that he was completely unable to do all of the things that he loved. He was very outdoorsy. He had a big family. He liked going camping and golfing and hiking. And since the day of the shooting, he no longer could do any of those things. His wife, Valdine, later spoke, and I watched this interview. It's pretty heartbreaking. She speaks about just how much of an amazing father and husband Nick was, but how that day really changed him. And although he died 11 years later from complications to do with that shooting, those 11 years were not fulfilling for him. They were not the life that he wanted to live. And Ronnie's actions that day, although they didn't kill him immediately, directly, they did ruin his life. And from his death row cell in Utah, Ronnie really, he really shows you who he is, because on one side, he's saying that he didn't mean to kill Michael and he only ended up shooting because he was scared and panicking and he'd been shot. So he was just kind of high on adrenaline and shooting back. But his behaviour over the next few years showed that that wasn't exactly true. He would brag later to different inmates, and his behaviour generally in prison was pretty despicable. In 1994, he was drunk on alcohol that he had brewed himself in his cell, and he ended up attacking a cellmate called Richard Fats, that's his nickname, Richard Fats Thomas, a man who had bragged about being a police informant. Ronnie had crafted this shank out of eyeglasses and he ended up stabbing Fats over and over again. Later, he mocked the attack, allegedly saying, and I'm going to quote this, "He was so fat, I think I was just stabbing fat. I stabbed all the way up to the hilt, but I don't think I got through." Despite all of this, he later would take some psychological tests, insisting that he was completely changed. He was a changed man. He admitted to having antisocial personality disorder, which we know he was diagnosed with, but said that he was no longer the same violent, impulsive man. He said, quote, "It wasn't some big religious experience, it was just time to grow up." And his lawyers argued that everything we've heard so far about his childhood being full of neglect and abuse, that should have been factored into his sentencing and he shouldn't be getting the death penalty. He should get life in prison. But there was no court that agreed. And so his execution date was set for June 18th, 2010. 3 days before his execution, Ronnie ate his last meal and he chose lobster tail, steak, vanilla ice cream, apple pie and a 7-Up. Then his last kind of days were a bit bizarre. He did a fast, which he said was spiritual. He did it for spiritual reasons, and that was for 48 hours. He watched Lord of the Rings, and he read a book called Divine Justice. And so on the day of his execution, he was walked into the chamber, and he was placed in this black steel chair, and there were sandbags either side, I suppose, to stop ricocheting bullets going anywhere else. And he wasn't actually able to see his executioner or executioners because there were a number of men who had volunteered and they were stood behind this wall with a gap that just fit the heads of their guns into it. And they were all facing Ronnie. The lights were so bright that he wouldn't be able to see past that. And they were then counted down, so 5, 4, 3, and just before the number 2, they all shot. No one knew for sure who pulled the fatal shot. He had this little 2x2 paper target that was placed over his heart, and that was where they were aiming to shoot for. One of the guns had a wax bullet in it, and that was so that no one would know for sure who had killed him. Medical staff came in just minutes later. They removed the hood from his head, checked his pulse, and declared him dead at 12:17 a.m. that morning. Ronnie's body was cremated, and it seems that his family and friends did really stand by him. And in fact, his body was given to his daughter, who took it home to Idaho to mourn the loss. Ronnie was the first person executed by firing squad in the US since 1996, and it's certainly something that we don't see happen much at all anymore. In the end, Ronnie's life was defined by violence, but it's the ones he stole. It's those people whose lives were cruelly taken away who should be remembered. Melvyn Otterstrom, a devoted husband and father working extra shifts to support his family, and Michael Burdell, who used his time to help people who needed it most. Their deaths left wounds that no execution could possibly heal. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Red Rum. As always, if you have any thoughts on this case, please leave them in the comments box down below. And other than that, I'll see you guys in a few days for your next episode. Bye.